The training grounds of Krelvor stretched for miles under a sky the color of cold steel, the air heavy with the faint scent of scorched metal from the Academy's ever-present machinery. Mason Cade stood among the assembled cadets, his boots sinking slightly into the dry, cracked earth as he scanned the horizon. He had been through countless drills in his months at the Intergalactic Cadet Academy, but nothing in the past had the same atmosphere of finality as the Predator Swarm trial. All around him, cadets from dozens of worlds shifted restlessly, some flexing claws, others clicking mandibles or stretching elongated limbs in anticipation. The ground vibrated faintly beneath his feet, a warning that somewhere beneath the surface, the swarm was waking. He adjusted the strap of his survival blade at his hip, the only weapon issued for this exercise. It was almost ceremonial, a gesture to give the illusion of a fighting chance. Everyone knew the swarm could not be fought, only avoided. The instructors stood behind a line of shimmering energy barriers, their faces unreadable. At the center of them was Commander Tavor, a massive reptilian officer with scales the color of oxidized bronze, his yellow eyes scanning the cadets one by one. His voice, deep and resonant, carried easily over the expanse. "You will have 10 minutes to survive. Those who fail will be marked as casualties. Those who succeed will be rare." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The swarm has only one directive: eliminate movement. It will find you by heat, by sound, by vibration in the air. There is no safe zone. Begin." The ground split in a dozen places at once, panels sliding back to reveal shadowy tunnels below. From them came the sound, an insectile chittering, overlaid with a mechanical grind, the noise swelling until it seemed to come from everywhere. Mason's heart quickened, but his hands remained steady at his sides. Around him, other cadets exploded into action. A tall insectoid named Verk shot forward in a blur of green limbs, covering 30 meters in seconds. A pair of scaled Thrin twins activated cloaking fields, their outlines flickering as they darted toward the rocky ridges to the east. The air shimmered with kinetic shields and low-power plasma bursts as some cadets tried to arm themselves with improvised weapons. Mason didn't move. Not yet. He let his gaze sweep across the plain, watching the patterns of the others. The first of the predators emerged, sleek, quadrupedal machines with bodies like jointed armor plates, their heads a cluster of sensor lenses that rotated in perfect unison. They moved low to the ground, flowing like liquid metal, every step silent despite their size. The moment they caught sight of movement, their bodies surged forward in a blur, and the first screams, raw and startled, cut through the air. A scaled cadet leapt sideways to avoid the leading predator, but another sprang from a different angle and took him down in a flash of claws and snapping metal jaws. Mason felt the urge to run press against his chest like a weight, but he forced himself to breathe slowly. Running was what the swarm wanted. He remembered the words of his old Earth survival instructor, a retired ranger who had taught him about patience. "Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is nothing, until the moment is right." Mason's eyes found it then. The tree. It rose from the flat ground like a relic of a forgotten age, its gnarled branches stripped of leaves, bark bleached pale by years under the twin suns. It was the tallest object in sight, easily 10 meters, its trunk scarred but solid. No cadet was heading toward it. The open ground leading to it looked too exposed, a death sentence to cross. But Mason saw something the others didn't. The predator's initial pounce was focused on the densest clusters of movement, not on single isolated targets. If he moved at the right moment, when their attention shifted elsewhere, he could reach it. He waited as the chaos erupted. More cadets fell. A mammalian female from the ice worlds activated a personal heat diffuser, masking her thermal signature, but the swarm's olfactory sensors picked up her scent and cut her down. The air filled with the smell of scorched composite armor. Mason bent his knees, muscles coiled, his eyes locked on the tree. Then he saw it. A gap. The swarm had surged toward a group of armored reptilians, momentarily ignoring his sector. Mason pushed off the ground, sprinting low, each step measured and silent as possible on the dry soil. The chittering rose in pitch behind him, and he didn't dare look back. He knew every second counted. The wind whistled through the bare branches above him as he closed the distance. The tree loomed larger, its shadow stretching toward him like a grasping hand. 10 meters, 8, 4. His fingers hit the bark, rough and splintering under his grip. He leapt, hooking a foot onto a knot in the trunk, hauling himself upward. The sharp edges dug into his palms, tearing skin, but he climbed faster, ignoring the sting. Halfway up, he risked a glance down. The swarm had reached the base. Dozens of predator bodies rippled beneath him, sensor lenses tilting up but not locking onto him. Not yet. His heart pounded, but his movements stayed precise, each reach for a branch deliberate and efficient. Above him, a thick limb jutted out, wide enough to support his weight. He pulled himself onto it, chest heaving, then pressed his body flat against the wood, forcing his breaths to slow. He had made it this far. Now came the harder part, remaining still long enough to survive. Mason pressed his chest against the cold, rough surface of the branch, the vibrations from the predators below traveling up through the trunk like the pulse of some monstrous heartbeat. The swarm had gathered in a loose perimeter around the tree, their segmented bodies glinting dully under the pale twin suns. Each machine moved with unnerving coordination, their heads turning in unison, lenses adjusting with faint clicks. Mason could hear the scraping of their claws against the cracked ground, the mechanical hiss of air being pulled through their olfactory sensors. Every so often, one would lift its head higher, scanning for heat or sound, but the rest paced, restless, as if they were deciding whether the tree was worth investigating. From his position high above, Mason kept his body still, his breathing slow enough that his chest barely moved. He knew from his training that predators, organic or mechanical, were hardwired to focus on the most obvious threat: movement. The swarm was no different. It could smell, it could hear, it could sense vibrations, but above all, it reacted to what it saw move. That knowledge was his only shield. He had no illusions about his situation. If even one of those sensor clusters locked onto him, the rest would follow, and no branch would keep him safe. He let his gaze drift over the battlefield. The other cadets were scattered across the plain, each fighting their own losing battle. To his left, a massive reptilian cadet named Gareth was surrounded, his claws slashing in wide arcs. He was fast, his muscles coiling with every strike, but the swarm adapted, its units breaking apart and attacking from multiple angles at once. Mason forced himself not to watch the inevitable. Beyond Gareth, 2 insectoid cadets scaled a rock formation, their many limbs working in perfect coordination as they climbed. But Mason saw their mistake instantly. Their rapid movements were like beacons. The predators at the base tracked them upward, launching themselves in impossible leaps, claws sinking into stone as they climbed in pursuit. Mason shifted his focus away. The sounds of combat rose and fell in chaotic waves, each one punctuated by a sharp mechanical screech or the dull thud of a cadet hitting the ground. The swarm moved with disturbing efficiency, like water filling every available space. Mason realized something important as he observed. The predators weren't just chasing at random. They were herding. The scattered survivors were being forced into smaller and smaller pockets, their escape routes closing until there was nowhere left to go. This wasn't just a hunt. It was a test of pressure and patience. His own position wasn't guaranteed safety forever. Sooner or later, one of the units might decide to climb, or the swarm might shift its tactics entirely. He needed to prepare for that possibility without breaking the stillness that was keeping him alive. Slowly, without making the branch sway, Mason adjusted his grip and pressed his forearm against the trunk, feeling its texture. The bark was brittle in places but solid deeper in. It could hold his weight if he needed to move higher. Above him, the branches grew thinner but denser, creating a natural screen. If he could work his way up another few meters without drawing attention, he might disappear completely into the skeletal canopy. He waited for his moment, keeping his senses open. Down below, the swarm suddenly surged toward the far side of the clearing, drawn by a loud, metallic clang. Mason recognized the sound. Someone had dropped a piece of equipment, maybe intentionally. The predators reacted instantly, half the group breaking off and moving as one toward the noise. That shift loosened the ring around his tree. He didn't waste the chance. With a careful pull, Mason slid one knee forward, hooking it over a higher branch. His muscles burned with the effort of keeping his movements controlled, each shift of weight measured so precisely that the bark barely crumbled beneath him. He climbed 2 meters higher, pressing himself into the cover of overlapping branches. From here, the view was clearer. He could see the entire trial ground, the network of small hills and jagged rocks that offered little real cover. He could also see the swarm's behavior in sharper detail, the way each unit adjusted its formation depending on the prey's species, the way their movements rippled outward like a signal passing from one to the next. It was terrifying in its precision. For a moment, Mason allowed himself to think about how this technology might be used outside the academy. These weren't just training drones. In a real war, unleashed on a city, nothing would survive for long. He shook the thought away and focused on the present. The sound of pursuit was moving further away, but the group still circling the base of his tree hadn't left. They continued their slow patrol, mechanical legs lifting and setting down with perfect rhythm. One of them paused, its head tilting upward. Mason froze completely, even his breathing pausing for a heartbeat. The sensor lenses rotated, scanning. He felt the intensity of its attention like a physical weight. Then, as if dismissing the thought, it lowered its head and resumed pacing. Mason allowed the smallest exhale, relief tempered by the knowledge that his margin for error was razor thin. The minutes stretched, measured only by the faint ticking of the swarm's inner mechanics and the distant fading cries of cadets who were now out of sight. The air felt thinner up here, the heat of the twin suns pressing against the back of his neck. He knew he had to conserve energy and water, keep his mind focused. This wasn't about beating the swarm with speed or force. It was about outlasting its attention span. And that meant committing fully to his choice, stillness above all. The thought solidified into a plan. If he could remain unnoticed until the trial's end, he would not only survive but prove something the instructors hadn't anticipated, that sometimes the best move in a hunt was to refuse to play the predator's game at all. Mason's arms ached from holding himself so rigid, but he didn't dare loosen his grip on the branch. Every sound from below was a reminder that one slip, one rustle of leaves could bring the entire swarm surging upward toward him. The predators that had remained near the tree were not aimlessly pacing. He could see now that they were methodically circling in overlapping patterns, each one maintaining a set distance from the others as if bound by an invisible grid. Occasionally one would pause, its sensor lenses swiveling upward for a fraction of a second before returning to its steady patrol. The precision was unnerving. He studied the group's rhythm, trying to read it like the movement of an opponent in a sparring match. Every few circuits, one predator would peel away and move to another sector, replaced almost instantly by another from the far side. It was a constant rotation, keeping fresh units in range without letting any linger long enough to lose focus. Mason realized this wasn't random. It was a way to prevent prey from predicting when the attention at a given point might lapse. If he wanted to take advantage of a gap, it would have to be so subtle and perfectly timed that even a rotating guard wouldn't register it. But climbing higher wasn't his only concern now. His vantage point revealed something the cadets on the ground probably couldn't see. The swarm's density was increasing in certain areas, and the spaces between predators were shrinking. This tightening of formation wasn't happening everywhere, only in pockets. He suspected it meant the trial was entering a new phase. The instructors were altering the swarm's behavior, perhaps to test those who had survived the first onslaught. That could mean one thing. The perimeter around his tree might soon close completely. His fingers tightened on the bark as he thought through his options. Staying still was still the best course, but if the swarm decided to scale the tree, he would need an escape route that didn't involve going down. The branches overhead might offer that, a way to move silently from tree to tree if another stood close enough. He craned his neck upward and scanned the canopy. Sparse though it was, he spotted 2 more trees, each smaller than his, but within a possible leap if he moved quickly and silently. He stored the thought away. It was a desperate plan, but better than none. A sudden sound cut through the tense quiet, not the metallic grinding of the predators or the distant cries of other cadets, but a sharp crack of wood splitting. Mason's pulse jumped. It came from somewhere to the right, where a lone cadet had taken shelter atop a tall rock formation. He couldn't see her clearly through the branches, but the movement of her arms suggested she had been trying to break off a piece of stone or wood, maybe to use as a weapon. The swarm reacted instantly. 4 predators detached from their patrol and raced toward the sound, their bodies blurring with speed. Mason's instincts screamed at him to move while their attention was diverted, but he forced himself to stop short. It was too soon. The gap was real, but it was small, and any shift in his branch could still draw the eyes of the remaining sentries. Instead, he watched, forcing his mind to stay detached as the cadet on the rocks fought a losing battle. She struck at one predator with the makeshift weapon, only for another to leap up and pin her down. The sounds that followed were abrupt, efficient, and final. The 4 predators regrouped in perfect unison, leaving nothing behind. The brutality of it reinforced what Mason already knew. The swarm wasn't here to challenge in open combat. It was here to erase. The attack also left him with a grim confirmation. The predators were fully capable of scaling vertical surfaces. That meant his tree wasn't an impenetrable sanctuary. He would need to be ready if one of them decided to test its limits here. He shifted his weight fractionally, letting one arm slide along the branch to a more secure hold. The motion was microscopic, but it reminded him just how tight his muscles had locked. A cramp in his left thigh throbbed dully, and he worked on relaxing it without moving the limb. He had learned long ago that stillness didn't just require physical control. It demanded mental control strong enough to override pain and discomfort. He focused on small, controlled breaths, letting his awareness stretch outward. The air carried more heat now. The suns were climbing higher, and the light was flattening the shadows below, leaving fewer places for the cadets still on the ground to hide. He could see one in the distance, a tall, broad-shouldered reptilian, moving in short bursts between rocks. The swarm was closing in, tightening its noose. Mason felt a strange detachment watching it happen, as though he were observing an ancient predator-prey dance rather than a brutal training trial. But even from here, he could feel the tension in the air shifting. The predators at the base of his tree were beginning to pause more often, their heads tilting upward with a fraction more interest than before. It was subtle, but he recognized the change. They were starting to consider him. That meant his window of invisibility was closing. He pressed himself tighter to the branch, the rough bark scraping his cheek. He needed to last until the swarm's cycle turned again, until the next big distraction drew them away. That could be minutes, or it could be seconds, but it would come. The challenge was making sure he was ready when it did. The trial was no longer just about staying still. It was about knowing when absolute stillness had to end. The predator's interest in the tree deepened with each passing minute, the subtle shift in their behavior becoming impossible to ignore. Mason could feel it in the way their heads lingered in his direction, the slow rotations of their sensor lenses, the almost imperceptible narrowing of the perimeter below. One unit broke from its pacing to stand still directly under him, its head tilting back in a slow, deliberate motion. The cluster of lenses locked upward for a fraction of a second before turning away again, but Mason knew it was no longer pure coincidence. The swarm's programming was changing. He had reached the point where stillness alone might no longer be enough. His mind ran through options in silence, each one tested and discarded within seconds. He could attempt to climb higher, bury himself in the branches, and hope the predators lost interest, but if the units decided to scale the trunk, he would have no time to react. He could leap toward one of the smaller trees he had spotted earlier, but that would mean a burst of movement that could trigger the swarm's full attention in an instant. Every scenario balanced on a blade's edge. He pressed his palms harder into the bark, grounding himself, focusing not on what could happen in the next 10 minutes, but on surviving the next 10 seconds. A change in sound reached him then, not the rhythmic patrols of the predators, but a low mechanical whine that came from the direction of the horizon. It grew steadily louder, accompanied by the faint tremor of the ground. Mason recognized it immediately as one of the swarm's aerial scouts. The trial had just escalated. The scout appeared moments later, gliding above the battlefield like a dark, wingless bird. Its frame was sleek, its underbelly lined with heat sensors, each one sweeping the ground below. The predators reacted to its presence by subtly shifting their formations, spreading wider, allowing the scout to pass between them as if it were an overseer checking for missed prey. Mason's pulse quickened. The aerial unit was a new threat entirely. His stillness might fool the swarm on the ground, but from above, the scout's sensors could pierce through his cover. He tucked his limbs closer to his body, pressing into the shadow cast by the thicker part of the trunk. The sun's angle worked in his favor for now, but he knew it wouldn't last. The scout's shadow slid across the tree, slow and deliberate. Mason held his breath, counting the beats of his heart. 1, 2, 3. The machine passed overhead without pausing, continuing its glide toward the far edge of the trial grounds. Mason exhaled slowly, careful not to let his muscles relax too much. That had been a warning. The swarm was broadening its search methods, and the longer he remained in one place, the higher the chance that the next pass would not be so forgiving. The predators below began a new pattern. Instead of pacing in long arcs, they moved in tighter spirals, circling the tree in increasingly narrow loops. Mason understood the tactic. They were conditioning him, forcing pressure into the space around him until it felt like a physical squeeze. The design was psychological as much as tactical. Many prey would panic under this kind of silent siege, making a sudden movement that broke their cover. He had no intention of giving them that satisfaction. The smallest vibration traveled through the branch, a new sound, faint but distinct. Mason tilted his head slightly, ears straining. It came from the opposite side of the trunk, the scratch of claws against wood. One predator was testing the tree. The pace was slow, deliberate, as if it were gauging the stability of the surface before committing to a climb. Mason shifted his weight subtly, making sure his boots were braced against a knot in the branch for leverage. If the machine came up, he would have to move without hesitation, using the upper branches to propel himself toward the smaller tree he had marked earlier. Every nerve in his body felt electric. The scratching paused, replaced by a metallic chitter. The predator retreated, its claws clicking against the ground as it rejoined the others. Mason didn't let himself relax. The test had not been abandoned, only delayed. His thoughts moved ahead of the moment, mapping out the route to the smaller tree in precise, minimal motions. Push up from the branch, grip the higher limb, use it as a springboard, and launch. No wasted movement, no hesitation. The heat from the suns was more oppressive now, trickling sweat down his neck. He willed himself not to wipe it away. The salt sting in his eyes was a minor discomfort compared to the risk of shifting his arm. A sudden surge of movement caught his attention. Two predators broke from the formation entirely, bolting toward a point in the distance where a muffled crash echoed. Mason used the disruption to adjust his position slightly, twisting his torso to face the direction of his potential escape route. His hands remained locked in place, every shift in weight measured against the stability of the branch. More minutes passed, each one stretched thin by the unchanging, suffocating presence of the swarm below. The predator's patience was inhuman, their movements unhurried but unrelenting. Mason knew the trial's end was still far enough away that any mistake would cost him everything. And yet, beneath the exhaustion and the tension, a strange clarity settled in. He could see the logic in the swarm's design, the cold efficiency of a system that didn't rush to kill, but instead wore down its prey. If he was going to outlast it, he had to mirror that patience, absorb the pressure without breaking, hold his position until the exact second when action would become survival instead of suicide. The next chapter of this standoff was coming. He could feel it building in the air like the charge before a storm. Mason kept his body molded to the curve of the branch, his breathing shallow and silent, as the charged tension in the air tightened into something almost palpable. The swarm had closed its ring until the predators were so near that the faint scrape of their claws against the ground blended with the vibration in the wood beneath him. His muscles ached from the strain of hours without rest, but he pushed the discomfort away, focusing instead on the rhythm of the machines below. That rhythm was about to change. He could feel it. The predators had shifted from slow circling to a pattern of sudden, sharp advances toward the tree's base, stopping just short before resuming their loops. It was a deliberate intimidation tactic, as if the swarm were probing for the moment he would panic and bolt. He did not move. Then the moment came. From somewhere deep in the trial grounds, a sharp, metallic detonation split the air, loud enough to echo off the distant ridge. Mason saw the swarm react instantly. Half of the units around his tree broke away as one, sprinting toward the sound with inhuman precision. The others tightened their circle, but the formation had a gap now, not wide, but enough. This was the window he had been waiting for, though it came earlier than he had planned. He shifted his weight in a single, fluid motion, rolling onto his knees without letting the branch sway. His eyes locked on the smaller tree to his left, the one he had marked hours before. Between him and it stretched a span of open air, 6 meters across. It would be a jump at the very edge of his strength. He drew in a slow breath, then pushed off. The branch flexed under his weight and released him into the gap, his body cutting through the hot, dry air. For a suspended heartbeat, he was weightless, the ground spinning far below, the predator's sensor lenses snapping upward. He hit the branch of the smaller tree hard, his hands gripping rough bark, his legs wrapping around for stability. The impact jarred his arms, but he didn't cry out. Instead, he froze again, forcing his body into stillness, even as the predators surged toward the base of the new tree. The gap had bought him seconds, no more. He climbed upward fast but silently, pulling himself into a tangle of smaller limbs near the top. The thin branches swayed with the wind, their dry twigs rustling just enough to mask the faint noise of his movement. He settled into a crouch, pressing his back against the trunk, watching as the predators swarmed the base. They circled, scanned upward, and then, to his surprise, began to withdraw. The detonation that had drawn half of them away had now called the rest. The clearing below was suddenly empty, the swarm moving in one coordinated wave toward the far horizon. Mason stayed where he was. Every instinct screamed that it was over, that the danger had passed, but he had learned enough in his life to distrust the moment things seemed safe. The suns had shifted lower in the sky, their light softening to a golden hue. Somewhere beyond sight, a siren wailed, the trial's end signal. The sound echoed over the plain, sharp and final. His body reacted before his mind did, a rush of relief loosening muscles that had been locked for what felt like forever. The predators broke formation completely now, retreating into the ground-level tunnels from which they had emerged, vanishing as if they had never existed. Silence returned to the trial grounds. Mason climbed down slowly, his boots finding purchase against the trunk, his hands scraping bark that now felt almost warm compared to the cold grip it had held earlier. When his feet hit the ground, the reality of his survival hit with it. The field was littered with scorch marks, claw gouges, and the debris of fallen equipment, but no other cadets stood in sight. He walked toward the central platform where the instructors waited, his steps steady, his expression unreadable. Commander Tavor's gaze followed him all the way in. The reptilian officer said nothing as Mason stepped into the marked safe zone, but there was an unmistakable flicker of something in those yellow eyes. Curiosity, perhaps even respect. Mason did not speak either. There was nothing to say that would matter more than the fact he was here, alive, when no one else had returned. The silence between him and the instructors stretched as the last of the swarm's chittering faded into the ground. He knew this would not be the last time he was tested like this, but for now, he had proven something the Academy's simulations had never considered: that sometimes, in the face of overwhelming force, victory came not from speed, strength, or aggression, but from the discipline to do absolutely nothing until the exact moment doing something would mean survival. He turned his eyes toward the horizon, the suns burning low and fierce, and felt the knowledge settle into him like stone. He had beaten the swarm not by outmatching it, but by refusing to be the prey it understood, and that was a lesson he would never forget.